energy policy has played a central role in the removal of another Australian Prime Minister, highlighting our inability to integrate energy and environmental policy. So, what policies and market structure do we need, and how will they balance energy prices, reliability and emissions? Today's panel will be discussing the opportunities, risks and challenges facing the environment and communities, as well as its relevance for trustees and super funds. On the stage and to be in the panel discussion today are Fiona Holyoake. She's the Managing Director of the Infrastructure Lead Advisory at PwC. Rory Lonergan, the Executive Director of Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and Ben Potter, a senior reporter from the Australian Financial Review. Now, just to note in terms of the format, we'll be hearing from each of the panellists. They will each be presenting for about 10 minutes, and at the end of all of their presentations, I will kick off a panel discussion. As always, your questions are front and centre and they're very welcome, so please use the app on your phone and just make sure you select Hall B, which is the hall we're in right now. But please put your hands together for our very first speaker, Fiona Holyoake.
This presentation has been prepared to give a high-level overview of the status and future of renewables, what is coming and where are the opportunities, risks and challenges, and the impacts on the environment, people, communities, cities and future. And in a nutshell, number one, renewables are here, and coal, love it or hate it, the Australian coal generation fleet we rely on has a lifespan that is declining. What is coming is disruption. There are opportunities, risks and challenges in trying to navigate policy which impacts certainty of investment returns. Energy is more and more going to be generated at the other end of the grid, and with it will come new technologies and business models. What is happening in Australia regarding energy is being framed by global market trends. 178 nations signed the Paris Accord. This was to combat climate change and limit temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius. 2018 saw the 8th year in a row that global renewable investment has exceeded $20 billion. China and India are leading the growth of renewable energy development. Renewables in India are set to increase from 2% today to 14% by 2040. And prices of lithium-ion batteries have fallen dramatically in recent years. For each doubling of output, lithium-ion battery prices have been getting 19% cheaper. Australia's energy market has been shaped by policy, and this is a very brief plotted history. The RET commenced in 2001 with the target of an additional 2% of renewable energy in the mix by 2010. In 2010, the RET target was increased to 20% renewables by 2020, or 41,000 gigawatt hours. 2012 to 14 saw the cap and trade emissions trading scheme, known as the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, and this was repealed in July 2014. In June 2015, the Australian Parliament passed a bill to amend the 2020 target from 41,000 gigawatt hours to 33 gigawatt hours. In 2017, the independent review into the future of energy security of national electricity market, commonly referred to as the Finkel report, proposed a clean energy target. 49 out of 50 recommendations of this report were adopted, except for the clean energy target. In 2017, the federal government rejected the SET in favour of the NEG. And 2 weeks ago, we know the NEG hit a snag. In question is the mechanism for emissions reduction. So this policy picture has led to the following trends. Australia did sign up to the 2015 Paris Agreement. Nearly $10 billion was invested into large-scale, $10 billion was invested into large-scale renewable projects. 17.3% of Australia's energy generation was from green sources, and this is towards the target of 23.5% for 2020. 30% of Australia's households have rooftop solar. And new business models and technologies are emerging via trials and investments to better match supply and demand. Corporates are seeking to procure renewable energy directly via corporate PPAs. Universities have been first movers, as well as corporates with large energy loads. Group buying is now a theme. And Telstra announced an energy strategy and have invested in wind farms. PwC and our peer advisors have been busy helping developers getting renewable projects to market, securing development applications, getting connections, debt and equity investors, and an offtake agreement to make it all happen with retailers or a corporate. We've been helping new technologies and companies secure funding and corporate and governments navigate their energy strategies. Australia's energy supply features increasing renewables and declining coal. In January 2011, the renewable energy target was split into two parts, large scale and small scale. The large scale scheme created a financial incentive to establish and expand renewable power stations such as solar farms, wind farms and hydroelectric power stations and deliver the majority of the 2020 target of 33,000 kilowatt hours, and it is predicted that we will get there. The small scale renewable target scheme was for systems under 100, and that has led to the proliferation of rooftop solar. The large-scale renewable target was designed to encourage additional generation from renewable sources. This is the projected growth of large-scale renewable generation. So there's currently 35 gigawatts of large-scale solar in various developments across Australia, and nearly 10 billion of investment went into 5.3 gigawatts of projects in 2017. So I'm sorry about the formatting of this chart, but I'm so struck by it. This is a graph that has been prepared by the Australian Energy Council in 2017, and it is the historic and forecast baseload coal power station decommissioning schedule. And yep, they're traffic lights. The NEM will need significant investment in new generation to replace existing baseload coal generation as they are decommissioned in the next decade. And if energy demand stays stable, the Australian Energy Council expects the need of around 15,000 megawatts of new firm equivalent capacity over the next 15 to 20 years. So firm equivalent could be new dispatchable generation, coal, gas or hydro, and then firm equivalent combinations of wind and solar and gas, wind, solar and storage, standalone storage or demand response. So love or hate coal-fired generation, it is in decline, and coal-fired power stations have a defined lifespan of circa sort of 50 years, and the Australian fleet is just getting older. So my first energy deal was the refinancing of Yallourn Power Station when it was held by New South Wales State Super, and an infrastructure asset managed by Deutsche Asset Management, and I was in the Deutsche team. The refinancing was led by UBS. So Yallourn Power Station was the second Victorian generating entity to be privatised in 1996, when it was sold to a consortium including Powergen, Itochu, AMP, Hastings and New South Wales State Super. This plant is currently owned by CLP. A decision was made at the time to hold the investment when China Light Power came in for a period, and at the time we just did not know what the forecast of electricity prices were going to be, and this made the decision to hold or sell a challenge. And our analysis included options and scenario weighted probabilities on the forecast prices of energy. And there's sort of two ironies in this story. Today, financing of coal is a challenge, and the same analysis is relevant to investment decisions today regarding renewables, with merchant curves being just as hard to predict and forecast. So you'll hear a lot about the term levelised cost of energy. So this is the cost that covers all lifetime expenses of generation from a new plant, and these will include site development, permitting, equipment, civil works, financing, operations and maintenance. And renewable energy now has a lower LCOE than new built coal. And this is the same picture in other international markets, including Germany, the US and Spain and Italy. So this decrease in LCOE is the result of a number of market factors. And I don't want to steal the fun thunder from anyone who's ahead of me, but very briefly, more efficient technologies, global decrease in generation equipment prices due to increased demand, greater competitiveness in the Australian engineering, procuring and construction market, and this is leading to a decrease in construction costs. And we see it's a competitive market. So these numbers were 2017 from a report in 2016, and we would see sort of wind at around 50 and solar PV sort of at around 60. So these numbers are from the Clean Energy Council report, and it's an interesting read. Bloomberg New Energy Finance keeps this data, and there are some great presentations online for numbers in 2018. So I love this picture. These are the themes that are disrupting the energy value chain. So policy and investment is impacting generation. Move to intermittent renewables are only viable or only generate when the sun shines and the wind blows. Batteries are still not quite there yet, and any investment in generation needs a long-term offtake agreement to underwrite that investment, usually with an energy retailer or more increasingly a corporate. Transmission and distribution networks have been privatised. Networks were really designed for electrons to only go one way. Are they the right spot to hold a big battery? Investments are being made now from this segment into edge of grid. We're seeing some smart meter deals and new technologies as strategies. So the retail customer and corporate customer of energy now has many decisions to make. No longer is it just picking a retailer for your energy contract. It is now a complex supply and demand decision. Energy supply can come from the grid, as well as rooftop solar and batteries. Energy demand is impacted by voltage correction, energy efficiencies, LED lighting and monitoring, smart meters, power factor correctors and software. Action is being driven to decrease bills and take action to care for the environment and reduction in carbon. So energy is I see energy as the Trojan horse into a corporate. Strategies need to be set. Where are they going to manufacture? What does their business consumption look like today and in the future? Then we've got energy retailers, a little bit in the middle of all this, focused on winning back the trust of the consumer, and they're looking for ways to harness the distributed energy of solar and batteries that are on the grid. So by 2050, the CSIRO estimates that 30 to 45% of Australia's energy will be supplied by customer-owned generators. This distribution is paving the way for the new world of energy generation. So this will mean virtual power plants created by linked up community and corporate and residential solar and batteries, and microgrids within precincts and peer-to-peer trading. So it's not all doom and gloom, but we're not quite there yet. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Rory Lonergan from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. So I think the conference organisers, when they put the future of energy down as the last session, I think they were either trying to find the most exciting session of the entire conference, or they were waiting for us to get as close as possible to the future, so that we might know what the future of energy is, because it is a difficult topic, particularly in the current environment. So I'm just going to talk to you very briefly just about a couple of things, just a brief introduction as to who we are at the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. What we're trying to do, a couple of words on the generation side, which are largely consistent with Fiona, a couple of graphs, and then maybe talk a little bit more about the demand side, because it's very easy to talk about the generation side when you talk about energy and the future of energy, but there is a flip side to the particular coin, which is the demand side and what's happening on that side. And that's particularly relevant to the people in this room because they own many of the assets that are the consumers of that electricity. So here we go. So the CEFC, some of you may have heard of us, so we've been around since March 2013. So we are a federal government fund. We are investing 10 billion of taxpayers' money with a stated goal of helping transition the economy from a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy at the lowest possible cost. We operate, we have a couple of headings under our mandate where we invest our money, and we invest debt or equity. We focus on renewable energy, the generation side. We focus on the built environment. We focus on transport and electrification. And we've recently started to think a bit more about biosequestration, because there are many graphs going around that suggest that to meet net zero targets for emissions by 2050, for example, we have to actually go negative in terms of carbon by sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere back into soils, etc. So to date, we've invested about, or committed about 5.3 billion of our $10 billion. It's invested across the economy. Roughly half of that is in generation. Last year we did 2.3 billion, of which 1.1 billion was project finance loans, typically into generation, and about $1 billion into other sectors of the economy, which include property, infrastructure, transport, agriculture, etc. And all of those dollars are directly aimed at reducing the carbon impact of all of those sectors. Why would you invest in clean energy? I suppose you would like to think it's self-evident, but ultimately what you're trying to do is create value and boost productivity through increased innovation. And there are probably few sectors that innovation is as important as it is in the energy sector going forward, due to the significant level of technological change and disruption, both new types of assets coming through, but also the impact on existing assets. It also a compelling reason to do it is investor demand. So there is an increasing demand, as you know, from super funds, from the superannuants. Particularly, people have started to talk about the millennial wave of capital coming through, which was the first time I'd heard people talk about a wave other than the baby boomers. So it sounds like there is a new wave starting to emerge on the horizon that has a greater focus on this and is demanding change. There are several drivers in the super sector that are increasing the focus on this. You'll be familiar with most of those: UMPRI, IGCC, RIAA, and the new kid on the block seems to be TCFD, which I always think is missing a letter because I find it hard to remember what it says, but task force, it's that F, I think there needs to be another F, on climate-related financial disclosure, which is new and emerging, but is driving investors to actually ask managers, what are you doing and what information are you going to give us on that? So we invest, we focus very heavily on the demand side, and what we try to do is we try to find leading managers, third-party managers, that either have an existing focus on driving ambition in terms of the demand side of the energy profile of their assets and the emission side, and basically try and push them further. And equally importantly is to try to be a leader in their sector, in the hope that other managers will follow that path. And I think that's where the super sector in particular has a very big role to play, by being increasingly demanding of third-party managers as to what are you doing in terms of the energy profile of your assets and the emissions profile of your assets. And there are obviously, you look at examples like Australian property, core, prime A grade is probably world leading, so there's no reason we can't be world leading in the other sectors. So this is an example of the people we've currently decided to back. We look for a manager, it's no different to the rest of the super sector. We look for institutional grade people. Pre-existing focus on energy is good, but if we can flip somebody, that's fine too. So we work very hard with them in terms of defining what goals and objectives are and what product design is, and I think product design is very important for the sector. A high degree of philosophical alignment is just makes it easier, because you can tell instantly the people who this is just how they run their business, and I think that is imperative going forward. It has to become core DNA for asset managers. I would say that the property sector is probably, as I say, a leader. I would say that the infrastructure, in terms of its focus on energy and emissions, is probably lagging, and that's largely driven by lack of benchmarks. The property sector has really been empowered by the neighbours rating system. That's a little bit lacking in the infrastructure sector. Agri is, I think, slowly starting to emerge, but again, it's something that as investors I think we can all demand more, and private equity I think is probably lagging as well. In terms of generation, I think Fiona said 10 billion in 2017. It was 9 billion went in 2018, and we think that there is probably 100 billion to go in by 2050. So the size of the investment opportunity is very significant. It's all been driven by, Fiona had a similar one on this, the declining levelized cost of energy. Everything is below new black coal. Very quickly it's going to be below, maybe by 2020, it's going to be below combined cycle gas, which is the most efficient type of gas, and rapidly tracking down that it will be cheaper to have renewable energy than to have refurbished coal plants, which is consistent with Fiona's trajectory for coal. What we're seeing in the generation space is people no longer looking to build just an isolated wind farm or solar farm. They're building a wind farm, a solar farm, and a battery complex all together. So that is, I think, a classic example of the future of energy in terms of the renewable space. You can't just build one of these isolated assets. You have to seek to replicate, I suppose, base load to the greatest extent, and that's where technology is really important. We talked about, Fiona talked about the corporate PPA sector. That is one of the next waves that's coming, and it's not just large corporates seeking to sign bilateral PPAs with a solar or a wind farm. The club of buyers is really starting to emerge, and we're seeing multiple corporates clubbing together to sign contracts with solar farms, and so solar farms, wind farms, and if they can bring the tribrid solar farm, wind and battery, they're more likely to be successful. I just wanted to touch briefly on the question of virtual power plants, and Fiona touched on it as well. That is really strongly starting to emerge now, and again driven by falling costs of technology, particularly solar, falling costs of battery, and that I think has the ability to reshape the landscape. So Australia is actually currently the world leader in distributed energy systems, driven by, I think, probably the penetration of rooftop solar. And I think rooftop solar is probably the one that everybody probably misses a little bit, and it is a little bit the silent force that just keeps going. It seems largely immune to policy, etc., and is driven just by falling costs of generation. I had the experience of putting some solar on my roof 2.5 years ago. 5 kilowatts cost me 10 grand. I reckon I could get the same one today for, I don't know, 5. So that will continue to progress and will, I think, drive some fundamental change. The last one I wanted to talk about very briefly was transport. So transport accounts for 16% of our emissions, right? Now it's a difficult one to corral in some ways from from an energy perspective. But what is going to fundamentally change it, I think, is the whole question of electric vehicles. So we commissioned a report with our sister organisation, Irani, recently, and some of the findings are very interesting, right? So we went for a low, moderate, and a high scenario, and if we just pick the moderate scenario, we found that 50% of all new passenger vehicles by 2030 could be electric vehicles, right? People will charge their car, their 100 kilowatt hour battery, which will get them probably 400 kilometers for $11 in 5 minutes. So, and that seems to be possible by 2024 based on the current technological change. They also found that, when I came to Australia, everybody told me that they needed a V8 Commodore because they drove hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. 99% of all trips are less than 50 kilometers, right? So that is just going to, I think, increasingly hasten the arrival of the electric vehicle. So 70% of people will just charge them at home. The other 30% live in flats and apartments, and they will just need alternative charging infrastructure. The impact on the generation on the demand side, I think, is estimated at about 2.4 gigawatts. So that was pretty much all I had to say. The last point was we are an investor. We're not. I was at Sam Cecilia's session yesterday where he said he had 900 million invested in VC. So we don't have 900 million invested in VC, but we have allocated 200 million to VC in the technology space. So that's evidence of the fact that it is one of the biggest markets prone to disruption, I think, going around. Thank you.
Thank you to Fiona and Rory for very nicely laying out the landscape, so I can skate very briefly over a couple of elements of this. The title of the session is The Future of Energy. So we know, it's been spelled out, we are signatories to the Paris Agreement, and according to the new Prime Minister, we are nominally committed to it. We have no visible means of support. But in the long term, the Paris Agreement and the global effort to reduce carbon emissions in energy and industry and transport and so on is clearly going to drive policy and investment. There's also the compelling economics that Fiona and Rory referred to, wind and solar getting cheaper, price of engineering a coal-fired power station, no matter what some people may say, just doesn't come down. It just goes up with construction inflation, essentially. So I think the picture is pretty clear in the long term for investors or for people in the power sector. It's carbon constrained. Wind and solar energy are going to become an increasing factor in the market. Storage as well, as a cost of battery and pumped hydro storage keeps coming down. And there's another element which is the sort of digital smart technology to actually optimise all the different generation assets that we're going to have in the grid and the transmission, because as it becomes more distributed, as Fiona described, the challenge of managing that becomes a lot bigger. And fortunately, we have some fabulous companies in Australia and around the world that are developing software systems and battery management systems and so on that can optimise a household or a business's use of its solar panels and sell to the grid when that's the best use of the resource, and take it from the grid and charge the battery when the price from the grid is low for a period, when it might be raining or something. So there's a lot of interesting developments in the digital smart technology. Now, despite what you might read on the front page of another newspaper this morning, the future is not coal, as Fiona described. All of these coal-fired power stations in our fleet, many of them are pretty ageing, and they have a scheduled use-by date, and the vast majority of them will close by that date. It's quite possible you could see some extensions, especially if the federal government is offering money for it. But I find it hard to believe that Vales Point could be extended for another 20 years beyond its use-by date, which is about sometime in the late 20s. So that's the long-term outlook. The present-term outlook is obviously policy uncertainty and chaos that we've seen in the last month or so. And before I describe how that's going to end up, it is worth noting that life goes on. And just this morning, as I was kind of poring over these notes and trying to think how I could make them timely and so on, an ASX-listed company called GenX announced that it is buying a 50 megawatt solar farm in development in western central New South Wales. I think it's near Forbes. They are as yet undecided whether they make it a merchant plant, which means it just takes its chances in the spot market, or seek an offtake agreement with a big energy user or a retailer, and they'll decide that factor down the track. So that shows that life goes on, but in an uncertain environment, obviously just looking at the time there, it's challenging for investors. How long might this uncertainty go on? Well, the election is the federal election, and it really is waiting on the outcome of the federal election to see where we go, because if you would have read, the government has sort of battened down the hatches and is saving the base and jettisoning any policy that you can't explain in a short slogan, and that includes the National Energy Guarantee. So that's 8 months to the election. If there's a change of government, there's a promise of more support, I guess, from the Labor Party, but they would take some months to sort themselves out anyway. So they'd have to decide whether they pick up the now abandoned National Energy Guarantee, or they go back to earlier ideas about emissions intensity schemes and so on. So you're really looking at a minimum of a year if there's a change of government. And of course, if the government is re-elected, which you can't rule out despite what the polls tell you, then and they're re-elected on the platform they currently have, then you potentially have another 3 years without an overarching target for emissions and clean energy in this country, which is a little bit disturbing, but there are always opportunities, and I think you have to bear in mind the long-term trend in the energy market is in the direction that we've described. It's got to be cleaner energy because that's what the world is demanding, and that's also what corporations are demanding, and therefore they're going out to sign seeking power purchase agreements with wind and solar farms, both to reduce their cost of energy, because it is, as we've heard described, cheaper than, in some cases it's even cheaper than existing depreciated coal plants, with the black coal price where it is at somewhere north of $130 a tonne. And they're certainly cheaper than anything that might come from new coal-fired power. And just allied to that, there's another factor, which is, although the government is kind of not really talking about emissions reductions policy at all, they do face a series of talks. In December, there's a UN Conference of the Parties meeting in Poland, I think it is, and it's really where the rubber hits the road on the Paris Agreement. Countries have to describe what concrete steps they're actually taking, what policies they have in place to deliver on their commitments. And they also have to start talking sometime in the next couple of years about how they might actually increase their targets, because it's commonly understood that the existing Paris commitments made in December 2015 will not keep global temperature increases to below 2 degrees, and that could lead to some pretty bad outcomes. So, the conventional wisdom in all this uncertainty is that investment in renewable energy will slow down. In the policy vacuum, however, don't forget Gen X, life goes on. And also there is a huge pipeline of investment coming through. It's almost entirely wind and solar energy, with a little bit of pumped hydro storage and some battery projects in there, but it's about 8,000 megawatts of generation when you take into account state renewable energy targets, possibly a bit more. That's about 1/6 of the existing stock of generation, so it's quite a very large amount of generation, all due to come onto the national electricity market in the next 2 years, by 2020. So when you have a pipeline like that, that was mainly stimulated by the renewable energy target, but it's actually now exceeded the renewable energy target, which the target for which peaks in 2020, and it is being additionally stimulated by demand from corporations, government businesses and so on for power purchase agreements from clean energy generation, and also from the state renewable energy targets, and also the compelling economics of renewable energy. And because of that, it's quite one of the risks that investors tell me they see is that there's an overshoot in the renewable energy market, and you get a kind of a sawtooth market for a few years until policy gets more settled into an orderly transition for energy. And what that means is that you get an oversupply of renewables flooding the market in the next 2 or 3 years as all these projects get finished and perhaps other ones come online as well. The price falls, which is great for consumers, and then coal generators say, well, maybe we'll retire 1 or 2 of our units for now. You know, they might have 4 or 8 units in the power station, and we'll withdraw that from the market, and the price will go up, and then we'll enjoy the benefits of that higher price in our other generators. And that can go on for a little while, and then the renewable sector will say, well, hang on, we've been out of the market for a while, and we haven't had, the pipeline slowed down. The price is now more attractive. We can turn these projects around very quickly, and you get another flood of renewables again, and the same process repeats. So you get this, up and down volatility in the wholesale electricity price, which is tough for generation owners, and they've seen a fair bit of it in the last couple of years anyway. All very challenging, but as I said, there's a long-term transition going on, and if you're an investor, if you're investment committee looking at what your executives are bringing you as options, anything with a long-term power purchase agreement has got to be bankable, because a 15-year power purchase agreement will underwrite the debt raising for a project, and that should get you over the period of uncertainty before policy settles down. Obviously, anything with Rory's organisation chipping in some of the equity or debt is going to be increasingly attractive. There is a theory that says in this uncertain environment, wind projects are a bit more attractive than solar projects, because wind can blow any time of the day. There's a lot of solar, utility-scale solar projects coming onto the market, and there's all the rooftop solar coming into the market as well, which is going at a great rate. That means the daytime price can be very compressed, and solar projects are captive to the daytime price, obviously, because that's when they generate, unless they have some storage. So wind has a wider horizon over which to play. Related to that issue about the concentration of solar generation in the daytime, pumped hydro storage, there's an increasing number of projects going on there. Same company, Genex, has a huge one at the old Kidston gold mine in Queensland. Don't forget transmission. Everyone's going to need transmission. It's completely agnostic as to where the electrons come from. And don't forget the digital smart technology as well. There's a lot of companies doing very smart things. It's been described to me as a little bit like the late 90s dot-com boom, where there are all these little companies, some of them getting bigger, some of them backed by the CEFC, doing fantastic stuff. But it's not clear how it's all going to come together, and over the next, 10 or 15 years, we're going to see who's going to emerge as the Google or the Amazon of energy. And because it's an uncertain environment, make use of your advisors from PwC and other firms and CFC. Thanks very much.
Thank you all for giving those presentations. We've got about just over 10 minutes for questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted the questions. Remember, you can keep doing so, just select Hall B. One of the first questions for the panellists here is, can we rely on policies at a state level to create incentives for renewable investment? Fiona, I might start with you on that.
So I think the states have been very focused on setting their own targets, and I think on the one level it adds a huge amount of confusion, but on the other hand, if the governments are really going to get behind reaching these targets, then they will be off-takers for a lot of the pipeline of projects that are looking to secure investment and equity and debt. What are your views on this?
I think what the states have had, and I think ultimately, right, it needs to be a national policy, a national solution, but where the states have been incredibly helpful is if we look at South Australia in terms of, being the test bed for new technologies. South Australia has there was a lot of fanfare around it, but it has the world's largest battery, which is having a big impact on the South Australian grid, in the virtual power plant world. There's a big trial going on in South Australia around that. So it seems that the states, for whatever reason, will continue, I think, to have a big role in pushing the sector forward by. Because of the appetite to be innovative.
Yeah, Ben, as a financial journalist that obviously has oversight not only nationally, but you do follow this quite closely. What's your view on how the states are responding?
Oh, I think Rory's right about South Australia. They got an incredible amount of flack for what they did. It was actually driven by federal policy, although the state government at the time obviously was very keen on it. I think the states are very important. You only have to look at how, they are the only game in town at the moment when it comes to emissions reductions, because the federal government vacated the field. Now that's obviously not going to stay the same forever, but for the time being, and whether it's 6 months or a year or 3 years, the federal government's not there, so the states are very important. You only had to look at how the Victorian government and the Queenslanders and AC2, although they're not that key because they're like a small amount of the New South Wales submarket, but they're under a huge amount of pressure from the federal government, from a lot of the energy industry and a lot of industry to let the National Energy Guarantee go through in the form it was in. But of course all that pressure went, and they resisted that, and then it all went away when it turned out that the federal government couldn't get it past its own backbench. But yeah, I think the states are quite important.
So then what's the sense from all of you about the progress? Is there hope for progress, that we're moving fast enough to still meet our Paris commitments, while we still have the current or similar dynamics in Parliament? Fiona?
I think the momentum's building, and the renewable train is heading in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a complete optimist about it, because I think that the level of technological advancement that's coming through, so there is a push and a pull happening, and I think it's I genuinely think that if we could look forward 20 years, that we can't even imagine today what the technological developments and those dropping cost curves can do. And I think, to the previous question, I think that's where the states have been incredibly important, because of their programs that they ran. The Queensland solar program, for example, it really kick-started the solar sector when it was really flat, right? And we saw within the space of 18 months, the CEFC put money behind it with ARENA, but within the space of 18 months, it was just incredible what had happened to cost curves.
I am a little bit surprised by both of your optimism, because we've just lost a Prime Minister over this. Ben, do you share this optimism?
Yeah, in the long run I do, because technology and everything points to it. There's only a minority of people in the country who don't want it to happen. They just happen to have their foot on the government's neck at the moment, and that's politics. One thing is, it does have to. I think the electricity sector will achieve, or can go close to achieving a 26 to 28% cut in emissions almost without policy. But that's not enough, because it's so difficult for the transport industry, industrial emission, burning gas to crack ethylene and so on. All the sort of industry, it's very hard for them to reduce their emissions. It's a sort of an intrinsic part of steel and cement making processes under current technology. So, and agriculture will have a really hard time. They say they've got some possible technologies for reducing the methane that comes out of cows, but we're yet to see it deployed. So it's very difficult for those other industries to do it. Electricity is about 30% or just under 30% of our emissions, I think. CSIRO put out a report last year saying that for the nation as a whole to meet the Paris target of 26 to 28%, the electricity sector should be doing 52 to 70% emissions cuts by 2030. Now, we're not talking about that yet. So I think I'm an optimist in the medium to long term. The short term is just, difficult again.
But I think, and this audience is key to the whole thing.
Yeah.
I think if you leave the generation side to one side, it's on the demand side. It's the asset owners who I think there is tremendous opportunity to reduce consumption. So it's not all about generation. It's about reducing consumption. And ultimately, the people who make those decisions are the owners of those assets. So to the extent that people can be more demanding of management teams as to what you're doing with the energy profile of your assets, and it's the investors who ultimately make those calls.
And I do think corporates will play a role. They have got sustainability targets. There's now corporate carbon reporting, and they will connect directly to the renewable energy source and underwrite that investment. That's not to say that the economics aren't important in that decision. It absolutely is, but the economics are getting there. I think the big question is firming. So you can't just rip up your, agreement and just go totally renewables without some firming, which the economics are getting there. But
Okay, so if one thing that is going to dominate public domain whenever the election is called are energy prices. From now until then, we're going to be talking about energy prices and how to bring them down. If the cost of generation is declining, why is the cost of energy so high?
I think it's because we handled the transition very badly. We had the former Labor government increase the renewable energy target without taking any steps to integrate renewable energy into the grid in a way that didn't harm the reliability of supply and the system security. The coalition came in, they had a review which was directed at cutting the RET, and it completely failed to pick up all the things that we discovered 2 years later from the Finkel review you could do to firm renewable energy and integrate it more reliably. So I think it's mostly that we've managed it very badly, and in the past renewables were more expensive, now they're not.
So are we ever going to see energy prices go down?
Over time, that's what all the credible modelling tells us, that wind and solar energy will get very cheap compared to fossil fuel generation, and the cost of storage will come down and the cost of managing it all.
This has been a political football for the last 10 years. One question here from the audience, David Hartley. By voting against Rudd's emission trading scheme, did the Greens effectively put climate action back a decade in Australia?
Quite
Anyone?
possibly, no.
We've got a very
I'm willing to say.
I feel like I've got to throw it to the journalist. Yeah.
I'm willing to. Yeah, that's obviously at least arguable. When you put it to Greens, they say, well, it doesn't matter because when the coalition got in, they would have run that campaign against renewable energy, and they would have changed it anyway. But had it been in place for longer than the longer and industry got used to it, then perhaps it would have, and we would have had the apparatus and the machinery for doing it all in place.
Yep.
So.
I've got a question for you, Rory. How will a likely change of government affect the good work of the CE Finance Corp?
I think so. We operate under an act of Parliament, right? So we are granted our mandate by that act. So absent any changes in that act, we will continue to do what we've been doing for the last 5 years, which probably sounds like a terribly political answer, but the plan is to just keep supporting the sector. And I think how we interact with the sector is changing over time necessarily, because the sector itself is evolving so rapidly. So we see our goal is to actually continually adapt to those changes in the sector, whether it's in terms of the financing techniques that we bring to the market, the products that we bring to the market, consistent with our aim of encouraging more capital in. We don't see our role as being the capital provider to the sector. We see our role as being the organisation that encourages other capital into the sector.
Fiona, what's the best way to sequester carbon?
Sorry?
What's the best way to sequester carbon?
Sorry, say the question again. Carbon.
What is the best way? Here, if we're going to read it. It's just like this. What is the best way to sequester carbon?
Well, certainly renewable energy is the technology is the supply and then the demand. So you've got incredible technologies which are matching on site, LED lightings, carbon. So you're not consuming the carbon. It's voltage correction island that goes around the business and the house to keep that voltage at that level. You see it in the inefficiencies of the grid and that intermittent dispersion transmission of when the lights flicker. So I think it's going to be a solution that is renewable technologies and on the demand side.
I think agriculture has a big role to play. Agriculture is 16% of the national emissions, and it has some of the biggest capacity to sequester carbon through changes in land use and farming practices.
Right.
So I think going forward, it's certainly something we are trying to encourage, that the agri sector gets in the game more extensively.
But I think if the question was aimed at carbon capture and storage, I've sort of followed the course of that for quite a while, and there was a lot of excitement about it, 5 years ago maybe. The technology is there to do it. You capture it, you remove it from the flue gases from the power station, and you pump it underground, and you hopefully put it into a stable geological formation down there so it doesn't come out again. The problem is that it takes 40% of the energy that you're producing from the power station to actually capture it and pump it underground. So it's in all the pilot projects that have been done to date, it's been too expensive and they've kind of been abandoned as far as I can tell.
All right, we are completely out of time. Can you please put your hands together for our panellists?